14th September 1942, Mamayev Kurgan, Stalingrad. Private Anatoly Kozlov pressed his face against the frozen earth as German shells screamed overhead, each explosion shaking the ground beneath him like the fist of an angry god. Around him, the strategic hill, height 102 on Soviet maps, had been transformed into a moonscape of craters, twisted metal, and the torn remains of men who had occupied these positions just hours before. His hands, raw and bleeding, clutched a Mushin Nagant rifle with a bayonet that had already taken 3 lives that morning. Across 100 meters of scorched earth, he could see German soldiers of the 71st Infantry Division preparing for another assault, their 6th of the day. Behind him, down the slope toward the Volga River, the city burned in a panorama of destruction that stretched as far as the eye could see. Somewhere in that inferno, his sister was hiding in a basement with her 2 children, praying the next bomb wouldn't find them. Anatoly didn't know it yet, but he was standing at the epicenter of what would become the bloodiest battle in human history, a 5-month nightmare that would consume over 2 million lives and transform modern warfare forever. This was Stalingrad. This was hell on earth, and it had only just begun. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the Second World War. Where are you watching from, and could you have survived 5 months in that inferno? To understand how 2 million people died in 5 months of urban warfare, we must first understand the strategic decisions that brought 2 massive armies to Stalingrad in the summer of 1942. Adolf Hitler's grand vision for the Eastern Front had evolved, or rather metastasized, into Operation Blue, the ambitious summer offensive designed to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus and the industrial city bearing Joseph Stalin's name. By June 1942, Nazi Germany controlled vast territories stretching from the Atlantic to the outskirts of Moscow. But Hitler's war machine was consuming petroleum at unsustainable rates. The Romanian oil fields at Ploiești could barely meet Germany's needs. Hitler's gaze turned south and east toward the Soviet oil fields at Baku, Grozny, and Maikop, which produced over 80% of Soviet petroleum. Capture those fields, and Germany would fuel its military for decades, while simultaneously strangling the Red Army's ability to continue fighting. Operation Blue launched on 28 June 1942 with devastating effect. Army Group South, reorganized into Army Groups A and B, drove eastward and southward with the precision that had characterized German offensives since 1939. Army Group A would push into the Caucasus toward the oil fields. Army Group B, spearheaded by General Friedrich Paulus's 6th Army, 270,000 men strong, organized into 22 divisions, would advance to the Don River bend and capture Stalingrad. Paulus commanded one of the Wehrmacht's most formidable formations. These were veterans who had fought through Poland, shattered French defenses, and driven deep into Soviet territory during Operation Barbarossa. They possessed the finest equipment German industry could produce: Panzer IV tanks with upgraded 75mm cannons, Sturmgestütz III assault guns, MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns that could fire 1,200 rounds per minute, and Nebelwerfer rocket launchers whose screaming projectiles terrorized enemy positions. By August, the 6th Army's advanced units reached Stalingrad's northern suburbs. The city stretched for nearly 30 miles along the western bank of the Volga River, a sprawling industrial complex dominated by 3 massive factories: the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory, which had been converted to produce T-34 tanks, the Barricade gun factory, and the Red October steel plant. Between these industrial giants lay workers' housing, administrative buildings, and the dense urban fabric of a city that had swelled to nearly 500,000 inhabitants. On 23 August 1942, The Luftwaffe unleashed its fury. Over 600 aircraft, Heinkel He-111 bombers, Junkers Ju-88s, and the dreaded Stuka dive bombers with their terrifying sirens descended upon Stalingrad in waves. They dropped thousands of tons of high explosives and incendiaries. Oil storage tanks along the Volga erupted in towering pillars of flame that could be seen for 100 kilometers. Wooden structures ignited instantly. Apartment blocks collapsed. Over 40,000 civilians died in that single afternoon, a preview of the horror to come. German commanders, viewing reconnaissance photographs of the burning city, believed Soviet resistance was effectively broken. They anticipated occupying the ruins within days. They had no comprehension that they were about to enter a killing ground unlike anything in military history. A battle that would consume lives at a rate of nearly 13,000 casualties per day for 5 consecutive months. The stage was set. Two ideologically opposed forces, each commanded by dictators who saw retreat as unthinkable, were about to collide in an urban landscape that would amplify human suffering to unprecedented levels. The first million casualties would come faster than anyone imagined possible. When German soldiers entered Stalingrad's ruins in early September, they discovered urban warfare that defied all previous experience. General Vasily Chuikov, commanding the Soviet 62nd Army tasked with defending the city, had developed a strategy born from desperate necessity. Transform every building into a fortress, deny the Germans the ability to use their superior firepower, and hug them close. Fight at such intimate range that German artillery and Luftwaffe support became useless. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, rat warfare. Combat occurred simultaneously across multiple vertical dimensions. A German squad might control a kitchen, while Soviet soldiers held the bedroom directly above. Battles raged in sewers beneath the streets, in ground-floor rooms, on staircases, in upper apartments, and on rooftops, all at the same time. The front line was everywhere and nowhere. Soldiers threw grenades through holes blown in floors and ceilings. They fought with bayonets, sharpened entrenching tools, and bare hands when ammunition ran low. The central railway station became a symbol of the battle's savage nature. On 14th September, the station changed hands 15 times in a single day. Soviet soldiers would storm the building at dawn. German counterattacks would drive them out by noon. Soviet forces would retake it by evening, and the cycle would repeat. The platforms became carpeted with bodies so thick that soldiers walked on corpses. Blood pooled in shell craters. The air was thick with the smell of death, decay, cordite, and raw sewage from broken pipes. One building became legendary, a 4-story apartment structure that would be known to history as Pavlov's house. On 27 September, Sergeant Yakov Pavlov led a 4-man reconnaissance patrol into the building and found it occupied by Soviet civilians sheltering in the basement. Rather than withdraw, Pavlov fortified the structure. Reinforcements arrived over subsequent nights, never more than 30 soldiers total, representing the Soviet Union's ethnic diversity: Russians, Ukrainians, Georgians, Uzbeks, a Kazakh, and a Tajik. They transformed the building into an impregnable fortress. Mines ringed the approaches. Machine gun positions covered every avenue of attack. They knocked holes through walls to create firing positions and movement corridors without exposing themselves to German fire. A supply line through the basement connected them to Soviet positions behind. For 58 days, nearly 2 months, this garrison of 30 men held against repeated German assaults involving infantry, tanks, and artillery. The casualties mounted with horrifying speed. Soviet reinforcements crossed the Volga River at night under constant German artillery fire, a 1,000-meter journey through hell. Barges and small boats, overloaded with soldiers and equipment, made the crossing through a hail of shells and machine gun fire. Many vessels were hit and sank, taking hundreds of men into the dark waters. Those who reached the western bank had an average life expectancy of 24 hours. Fresh divisions crossed at night, moved into forward positions before dawn, and by the next evening had been reduced to company strength. One Soviet lieutenant, whose diary was found on his frozen body weeks later, wrote, "We crossed the Volga at 0000 hours, 200 men in my company. By dawn, 120 remained. By noon, 60. By sunset, I commanded 15. Tomorrow we attack the tractor factory. I have written my mother's address on my body so they can notify her when I die. I do not think in terms of if anymore, only when." The German Sixth Army bled itself white in these ruins. Every advance was measured in meters and paid for in blood. The 389th Infantry Division lost 80% of its strength, taking a single city block. The 24th Panzer Division, which had swept across France in 1940, found its tanks immobilized in rubble-choked streets where Soviet anti-tank teams could approach from multiple directions. Casualties exceeded 50,000 by mid-October, and still the city had not fallen. By early November, German forces concentrated approximately 90% of Stalingrad, the central district, the railway station, most of the factory complexes, but that final 10%, clinging to narrow strips along the Volga's edge, refused to die. General Paulus reported repeatedly to Hitler that the Sixth Army was exhausted, that replacements were inadequate, that winter was approaching and his men still wore summer uniforms. Hitler's response was always the same: press the attack, victory is near, Stalingrad must fall. What neither side fully grasped yet was the scale of human destruction they were creating. In just 2 months, August and September, the battle had already consumed over 400,000 casualties. The daily casualty rate exceeded 6,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. At this rate, the battle was killing more people per day than the entire American Civil War killed per week, and the worst was yet to come. While the world's attention focused on the savage street fighting in Stalingrad's ruins, Soviet High Command prepared the operational masterstroke that would transform the battle from urban meat grinder into strategic catastrophe. General Georgy Zhukov, architect of the Moscow counteroffensive in 1941, had identified the fatal weakness in Germany's position. The long flanks of the Stalingrad salient were held by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian armies, poorly equipped, inadequately trained satellite forces that lacked sufficient anti-tank weapons to stop massed Soviet armor. Throughout October and early November, Soviet forces concentrated over 1 million troops, 13,500 guns, 894 tanks, and 1,115 aircraft north and south of Stalingrad. The buildup occurred under strict operational security. Units moved only at night, radio silence was rigidly enforced, dummy positions deceived German aerial reconnaissance. By mid-November, the trap was set. At 0730 hours on 19th November 1942, the northern pincer struck. Over 3,500 Soviet guns erupted along an 80-mile front held primarily by the Romanian Third Army. The barrage lasted 80 minutes, a wall of steel and fire that obliterated defensive positions, severed communications, and buried command posts. Romanian soldiers, huddled in inadequate bunkers, experienced an apocalypse of violence that shattered entire divisions within hours.
Then came the armor. Hundreds of T-34 medium tanks and T-70 light tanks surging through fog and light snow. Their broad tracks, designed specifically for Russian terrain, grinding through the frozen ground. The Romanian front collapsed. Some units fought bravely, but were overwhelmed. Others surrendered en masse or fled in panic. By nightfall on 19th November, Soviet mechanized columns had penetrated 50 kilometers behind German lines and were racing westward toward the Don River crossings and the vital town of Kalach on the Don. The next day, 20th November, the southern pincer attacked with equal fury. Once again, devastating artillery preceded armored exploitation. The Romanian Fourth Army disintegrated under the assault. German reserves rushed to plug gaps, but there were too few reserves and too many gaps. On 23 November, at approximately 1600 hours, advance elements of the Soviet 26th Tank Corps met troops from the 4th Tank Corps near Kalach. The ring closed. Inside the pocket, the entire German 6th Army, 290,000 men, plus elements of the 4th Panzer Army and 2 Romanian divisions. It was the largest operational encirclement in military history. The casualties from Operation Uranus itself were staggering. The 4 Romanian armies involved, 3rd, 4th, and elements of 2 others, lost approximately 150,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured in 4 days of fighting. Soviet casualties exceeded 75,000, but these numbers were merely prologue to the slaughter that would follow. General Paulus immediately recognized the catastrophe and requested permission to break out westward while a corridor still existed. His message to Army Group headquarters was urgent. The 6th Army had perhaps 72 hours to force an escape before Soviet forces consolidated their positions. A fighting withdrawal could save perhaps 200,000 men. Hitler's response came swiftly. Hold at Stalingrad. Form hedgehog defense. Supplies will be delivered by air. Do not retreat. This decision, refusing to authorize the breakout, transformed what could have been a severe defeat into an unmitigated catastrophe, and it set the stage for 4 months of suffering that would add another 1.6 million casualties to the toll. The German pocket, the Kessel, as soldiers called it, became a frozen hell, where men died as much from starvation and cold as from Soviet bullets. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring had promised that the Luftwaffe could supply the 6th Army by air, delivering 750 tons of supplies daily. It was a logistical fantasy. The airlift never delivered more than 300 tons in a single day, and usually far less. Rations were cut repeatedly. By early December, German soldiers received 200 grams of bread per day, about 2 slices, supplemented by watery soup made from whatever could be scavenged. Horses were slaughtered and eaten, supply horses first, then artillery horses, finally officers' personal mounts. When the horses were gone, soldiers boiled leather belts and harnesses to extract minimal nutrition. Men began dying not from wounds, but from simple starvation. The cold was equally merciless. Temperatures plunged to minus 30 degrees Celsius and below. German soldiers, the majority still wearing summer uniforms because winter clothing had been promised but never delivered, suffered mass frostbite casualties. Entire companies became combat ineffective not from enemy action, but from cold injury. Fingers and toes blackened with frostbite. One German doctor wrote, "I amputated 7 frozen feet yesterday without anesthesia because we have no morphine left. The men screamed, but what else could I do? If I leave the gangrenous tissue, they die from infection. If I amputate, they might survive. Probably they will die anyway."
Disease spread rapidly through the pocket. Dysentery ravaged men weakened by malnutrition. Typhus, carried by lice that infested every uniform, appeared in late November and spread through overcrowded bunkers where men huddled for warmth.
Without adequate medical supplies, treatment was impossible. The wounded lay in frozen cellars converted to aid stations, their groans gradually falling silent as they died from shock, hypothermia, or infection. A German relief operation, Operation Winter Storm, launched on 12 December under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, briefly gave hope. His 4th Panzer Army drove northeast through brutal Soviet resistance. By 19th December, advance units had closed to within 35 miles of the pocket perimeter. German soldiers inside the Kessel could hear the distant rumble of artillery and dared to believe rescue was possible. Paulus requested permission to launch Operation Thunderclap, a breakout toward the relief force. Combined with Manstein's attack, it offered the last realistic chance of saving 200,000 men. But it required abandoning Stalingrad, abandoning heavy equipment, abandoning Hitler's symbolic objective. Hitler refused. Hold Stalingrad. The Sixth Army would tie down Soviet forces. Relief would arrive. Maintain positions at all costs. The moment passed. Soviet counteroffensives threatened to encircle Manstein's force. Operation Winter Storm collapsed. The relief column retreated. By Christmas Day 1942, hope died in the Stalingrad pocket, and the dying accelerated. Daily casualties in December averaged 1,500 Germans inside the pocket and similar numbers of Soviets attacking from outside. But these were combat casualties. Hundreds more Germans died daily from starvation, cold, and disease, deaths that didn't appear in battle reports but were no less final. By early January, the pocket's effective combat strength had fallen below 100,000 men, with another 90,000 too sick, wounded, or weak to fight. One German soldier wrote in a letter found on his frozen body, "Dear Mother, it is Christmas Eve, and I am so cold I cannot feel my feet anymore. We have not received supplies in 3 days. Yesterday, Karl died, not from Russian bullets, but from simply being too weak and cold to continue living. He went to sleep and never woke up. I envy him. We were told relief was coming. It did not come. We were told to hold on. But for what? So we can die here instead of at home? I no longer understand why we are here. I no longer believe we will leave. Please remember me as I was, not as I have become." Soviet forces launched Operation Ring on 10 January 1943, a systematic operation designed to compress and destroy the pocket in segments. What followed was industrial-scale killing that added hundreds of thousands more to the casualty count. Artillery barrages of unimaginable intensity preceded each assault. Soviet guns fired over 300,000 shells in the first 3 days alone. Entire German positions simply ceased to exist, obliterated by concentrated fire. Soviet infantry and tanks advanced through blizzards against defenders too weak to offer effective resistance. German soldiers, many weighing less than 50 kilograms after weeks of starvation, could barely lift their weapons. Frostbite had claimed so many that some companies had more men unable to walk than able-bodied soldiers. Yet they fought with desperate determination, knowing that surrender offered uncertain fate in Soviet captivity. The pocket shrank daily. Pitomnik Airfield, the last major landing strip, fell to Soviet forces on 16 January, eliminating almost all airlift capability. Wounded could no longer be evacuated. They lay in freezing cellars, their final letters home unsent because there was no way to send them. Morphine was long exhausted. Bandages were improvised from clothing. Amputations were performed with hacksaws. On 22 January, Soviet forces split the pocket in two, isolating the southern group containing Paulus's headquarters from the northern group. Each sector now fought its own isolated battle. Communication between the pockets ceased. Each thought the other might already be destroyed. The casualties during Operation Ring were catastrophic. Soviet forces lost approximately 1.13 million killed and wounded in the three-week offensive, an average of over 7,000 casualties per day. German and Axis military casualties were equally horrific, roughly 100,000 dead in the pocket during January alone, with another 90,000 captured when resistance finally ended. On 30th January 1943, the 10th anniversary of Nazi seizure of power, Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal in a cynical gesture meant to encourage suicide. No German field marshal had ever surrendered, but Paulus, emaciated and lice-ridden, refused to die for Hitler's symbolism. On 31st January, Soviet troops stormed his headquarters in the basement of the Unimerg department store. Paulus surrendered the southern pocket. The northern group under General Karl Strecker fought until 2nd February before laying down arms. Of 290,000 men encircled in November, approximately 91,000 marched into Soviet captivity, barely alive, most weighing less than 50 kilograms, many dying within days from the simple shock of liberation and inability to process food after months of starvation. Only about 6,000 would ever return to Germany. The final casualty figures for the Battle of Stalingrad remain debated by historians, but the most reliable estimates paint a picture of unprecedented carnage. From August 1942 to February 1943, 5 months and 1 week, the battle consumed over 2 million lives through killed, wounded, captured, and missing. Soviet military casualties, approximately 1.13 million, including 478,741 killed or missing, and 650,878 wounded or sick. These figures encompass all Soviet forces involved in the broader Stalingrad campaign, including the defense of the city and the encirclement operations. German and Axis military casualties, approximately 850,000, including roughly 400,000 Germans killed, wounded, or captured, plus approximately 450,000 Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian casualties from the satellite armies destroyed during Operation Uranus and subsequent fighting. Soviet civilian casualties, estimates range from 40,000 to 100,000 killed, with tens of thousands more dying from starvation, disease, and exposure during and after the battle. The exact figure will never be known because record-keeping collapsed during the battle. German civilian casualties. Several thousand ethnic German civilians and Volksdeutsche were trapped in the pocket and died during the final battles or in Soviet captivity. The daily casualty rate averaged approximately 13,000 per day across both sides over 154 days of battle. At its peak in October and November, casualties exceeded 20,000 per day. To put this in perspective, Stalingrad killed more people in 5 months than the United States lost in combat during the entire Second World War. The city itself was destroyed. Of approximately 40,000 buildings in Stalingrad before the battle, fewer than 2,000 remained standing. The tractor factory, the pride of Soviet industrialization, was reduced to twisted metal and rubble. The Volga River's western bank was carpeted with destroyed equipment. Over 1,500 destroyed Soviet tanks, 2,500 destroyed Soviet guns, 750 destroyed German tanks, and countless smaller vehicles and weapons.
When spring came in March 1943, the thaw revealed the true scale of death. Bodies, German and Soviet, emerged from melting snow by the thousands. Entire city blocks were discovered to contain basements full of frozen corpses. The cleanup operation would take months and involve over 50,000 workers. Even years later, Construction workers in Stalingrad would regularly uncover remains. One Soviet soldier who helped with the cleanup later wrote, "We found them everywhere, in cellars, in sewers, in collapsed buildings. German and Soviet, frozen together sometimes, having killed each other in close combat, and then frozen in death's embrace. We found positions where entire squads had frozen at their posts, German and Soviet alike, still manning weapons they could no longer fire because their hands had frozen to the metal. I helped bury 847 bodies in 1 week. I stopped counting after that. It was too much for the mind to accept." Stalingrad's 2 million casualties represented more than statistical horror. They marked the strategic turning point of the Second World War in Europe. The psychological impact reverberated globally. In Berlin, the disaster could not be concealed despite Goebbels' propaganda efforts. German families learned that sons, brothers, and fathers had vanished into the Eastern Front. The myth of German invincibility died in Stalingrad's ruins. Throughout occupied Europe, resistance movements took heart. Germany could be beaten. The Wehrmacht was not unstoppable. In London and Washington, Allied strategists recognized that the Soviet Union would not collapse and could systematically destroy Germany's best formations. The strategic initiative had passed permanently to the Red Army. The battle validated Soviet defensive doctrine and urban warfare tactics. The concept of defense in depth, the transformation of cities into fortresses, hugging enemy forces close to negate their firepower advantages, all would be refined and applied in subsequent battles at Kursk, in Belarus, and ultimately in Berlin itself. For Germany, Stalingrad represented catastrophic losses that could never be replaced. The Sixth Army had been one of the Wehrmacht's finest formations. 22 divisions, the equivalent of the entire force that invaded France in 1940, simply ceased to exist. Gone were experienced officers who had commanded since Poland, NCOs who had survived 3 years of combat, specialists and veterans who formed the Wehrmacht's institutional backbone. More critically, Stalingrad shattered German confidence and validated Soviet determination. German soldiers throughout the Wehrmacht began to question whether final victory was possible. Soviet soldiers who had endured 2 years of devastating defeats and retreats finally had proof that they could not only survive German offensives but destroy German armies. General Zhukov, who had commanded the 62nd Army's defense of Stalingrad, would lead his forces westward for the next 2 years, across Ukraine, through Poland, and finally to Berlin, where he would accept the German surrender in May 1945. The lessons learned at terrible cost in Stalingrad's ruins would serve him well in every subsequent battle. The civilian population of Stalingrad would rebuild their city from ruins, a process that would take years and leave physical and psychological scars that persisted for generations. The city was renamed Volgograd in 1961 during de-Stalinization, but the battle forever defined the city's identity. Monuments to the battle dot the landscape. Atop Mamayev Kurgan, the strategic height where Private Anatoly Kozlov had fought on 14 September, stands The Motherland Calls, an 85-meter statue of a woman with raised sword that remains one of the world's tallest statues. During the battle's fiercest fighting, the hill changed hands multiple times per day. After the battle, Soviet authorities claimed they found 1,200 shell fragments and bomb fragments per square meter of soil, literal evidence that the hill had been transformed into hell on earth. In that frozen basement where Private Anatoly Kozlov fought for his life on 14th September, he could not have imagined that the battle just beginning would consume over 2 million lives before it ended. He survived the battle, but his sister and her children did not, killed by a German bomb 3 weeks into the fighting. He fought through the entire campaign, was wounded twice, and ended the war as a junior lieutenant in Berlin. He never spoke about Stalingrad to his family, except to say once, "We won, but the price was too high. No victory is worth 2 million lives." The soldiers who died at Stalingrad, German and Soviet alike, were not statistics or chess pieces, but individual human beings with names, families, and dreams. They died in conditions of almost unimaginable horror, freezing, starving, wounded, terrified. Many died not heroically in combat, but miserably from hunger, disease, or cold. They died because two totalitarian ideologies, Nazism and Stalinism, saw human life as expendable in the pursuit of territorial and ideological objectives. Hitler's refusal to authorize the Sixth Army's breakout condemned 200,000 German soldiers to death by starvation and cold, because admitting the need for retreat would have meant admitting strategic failure. Stalin's refusal to evacuate Stalingrad's civilian population before the battle condemned tens of thousands to death because maintaining a populated city supposedly strengthened defenders' resolve. Both decisions prioritized ideology over human life. The 2 million casualties at Stalingrad represent the cost of total war fought by totalitarian regimes, a war where cities were destroyed as symbols, where armies were sacrificed for prestige, where human suffering was deemed acceptable in pursuit of ideological objectives. It stands as a warning about the cost of fanaticism and the price ordinary people pay when leaders prioritize political goals over human welfare. On that September morning when Private Anatoly Kozlov looked across the crater-pocked landscape of Mamayev Kurgan and saw German soldiers preparing to attack, he was standing at ground zero of what would become the deadliest battle in human history. Over the next 5 months, 2 million people, soldiers and civilians, Germans and Soviets, men and women and children, would die in a battle that transformed modern warfare and marked the turning point of the Second World War. Stalingrad was where Hitler's dreams of Eastern conquest died in frozen ruins. It was where the Red Army proved it could not just survive, but systematically destroy the Wehrmacht's best forces. It was where 2 million lives were consumed in 5 months of combat, so intense, so savage, so unrelenting that it averaged 13,000 casualties per day, more killed, wounded, and missing every single day than many entire battles of previous wars. The city was rebuilt. Memorials were erected. Survivors told their stories, though many never could bring themselves to speak of what they had witnessed. But the number remains, stark and terrible. 2 million casualties in 5 months. It was pure hell, and its legacy shaped the rest of the war and the world that followed. But while the Eastern Front consumed armies in battles of annihilation, American and British forces were planning their own critical operations that would open new fronts and begin the liberation of occupied Europe. Join us next time as we uncover the story of Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa in November 1942 that marked America's first major offensive against Nazi Germany and set the stage for the invasions of Sicily and Italy.